The following program is made possible by the friends and partners of Creation Today.
I still remember sitting on my living room couch with my son, Jordan, watching one of our favorite cartoons, Dinosaur Train. This particular episode was a little bit different though. They were introducing the idea of dinosaurs having feathers. And this brought up a very interesting conversation between my son, Jordan, and I. Well, not long ago, I was also reading a Biologos writer, Ryan, and I don't know how to say his last name, B-E-B-E-J, just so I don't butcher it. And he said as he sat watching a crane in the water and it struck into the water and grabbed a fish, he said all of a sudden I was struck by the resounding fact that I wasn't out here watching birds, I was watching dinosaurs. So what's up with the whole dinosaur to bird evolution? Could that really have happened? Is that even possible? It's certainly something that's being pushed from an evolutionary perspective to try to bring everybody on the same page to say, hey, everything evolved slowly over time.
Welcome to the Creation Today show, where we bring together interviews with experts and solid Bible teaching. Your host, Eric Hovind, affirms the ultimate authority of God's Word, the truth of creation, and why it matters to you.
Hey, if you're watching on YouTube or Facebook, a little shout out to you guys. Appreciate you guys being on here. And to our podcast and television audience, thank you guys for tuning in. You're going to love today's conversation. And as a reminder, you are just one step away from partnering with what we do to spread the truth around the world and turn stumbling blocks into stepping stones for people, one life at a time. We truly would be delighted to see you or your family or business partner with Creation Today. And when you do that, you get full access to our conversations, past, present, and future. So come on over to creationtoday.org/partner and feel free to join with us for whatever you'd like. Partners, thank you guys for being on here for today's conversation. As always, it is great to have guests that we can talk to. Our guest today is somebody you're going to love. You're going to fall in love with her very, very quickly. She earned her PhD in geology and paleontology from the Federal University of, and I forget how to say the name. I'm going to ask her here in just a second, but it was in Brazil, South America. And she was working in conjunction with the University of Kentucky. She serves in the research department at Answers in Genesis. And if you watch Answers News, you'll get to see her on Answers News as well from time to time. And she's studied extensively the supposed dinosaur to bird evolution. And in her latest article about the dinosaur to bird evolution, how do I describe this to you? Well, you know how the farmers back in the day would kill chickens by stretching the neck over the little log and whoosh. That's what she does to the supposed dinosaur to bird evolution. You're going to love her. She's here joining me to talk about it, Dr. Gabriela Haynes. Dr. Haynes, thanks so much for joining me today.
Thank you very much, Eric, for your invitation. I'm very pleased and very happy to be here with you.
So the state in Brazil that you got your degree from, the University of?
Ceará.
Ceará, that's it. Sorry, I never took Spanish or Portuguese or anything like that growing up. So Ceará, and you actually got it in paleontology and geology, right?
Yes. My undergrad, it's in biology, and then my grad school, it's geology, paleontology. Yeah, that's what I study for 7 years. Mm-hmm.
What made you want to jump into biology, geology, paleontology?
Well, I love this question because then I have a chance to share something about my personal life. So I was raised Christian, and when I went to school, I was 17 when I went to college to study biology. I got bombarded with so much of evolution. Then in the beginning, I was all strong and firm in my faith. And then I just started walking away from God because I just didn't have any answer. I was just thinking, well, if everything that I have learned from church, being raised as a Christian is wrong. And they're the ones saying the right thing, I have to just walk away. So I stopped going to church and hanging out with my Christian friends and stopped reading the Bible. And I was walking around, and I was at the time the president of the biology students. And then someone came and say, hey, a creation scientist is coming. Can't you help us to find a place for him to talk and everything? And I was like, oh yeah, sure. And then I kind of helped him to get a place, and he went to the place, the scientist, and my friend actually said, hey, why don't you come to watch his presentation? I said, yeah, I'll see if I can make it. But in my mind, I was like, what in the world? The Christian is going to talk about science, you know? And but I went there that evening, and I heard him talking, and God used him to open my eyes. And I remember that evening, talking to God and say, God, forgive me for my sins and for what I have done. I want to go back to you, and I want to do whatever it's necessary. If you want me to get my master's, my PhD, because I wanted to be just like him. I wanted to do to others what he did to me. And it's very interesting. God heard my prayer. You know, it was a very sincere prayer. And I finished biology, and then God opened doors for paleontology. And yeah, so I got my PhD, and here I am. Answers in Genesis. And one thing that was interesting, that man, the scientist man, he was the first one that actually mentioned answers in Genesis. At the time, they didn't even have the Creation Museum. So I remember I had like a little notebook thing that I was always with me, and I wrote it, answersingenesis.org. And of course, at the time, you had like the internet that you had to wait until like midnight to access. Yeah, I'm a little bit old. And I just check all the material from Answers in Genesis, and I start studying and reading and getting answers. And before, I was very afraid of talking to anyone that even asked me about my faith. And then later, when I start getting answers, I was just like looking around and walking around, and it's like, hey, are you an atheist? Do you want to talk to me? What do you think about this? What do you think about that? Yeah, I was kind of the only person like that in school, because now I had answers. So I was excited to share. I was not afraid anymore. So it was really good for me. And then they didn't have the Creation Museum at the time. So after 2 years and a half, they had the museum. I saved money, and I came here for the first time to the United States to volunteer for the Creation Museum. I was the first Brazilian to volunteer here for the Creation Museum. So that's the story. And I mean, I wanted to do something that was related to Bible and science. And geology and paleontology got opened the doors for me, and it was just like the perfect fit for what I wanted to do, you know, when I understand that God has called me to do this.
What a cool story. And yeah, it seems like God literally directed you there. I want to jump into the dino bird evolution, but because of your story, I got to ask, do you remember some of the things in biology that started to put the chinks in your armor and the chinks in your faith and made you start to doubt? Do you remember some of those things that they were teaching that would have made you kind of go, oh, well, if that's true, then this can't be true, and made you question the Bible?
Yeah, well, the first thing is, when we go to sometimes Sunday school, you know, and we're learning about the stories of the Bible. So it's just like that kind of boat, funny boat with the animals here and there playing and doing those kind of stuff. And then when you go to university, when you go to college to study, it's just like, well, it doesn't really make sense, because I mean, that kind of animals, that type of boat, Noah's Ark, wouldn't fit all those animals, the animals that we have here. Because I was studying biology, taxonomy, so many animals, and I was like, it's impossible, you know, for those things to come to life. And then you start talking about Lucy, and they show all those pictures with Lucy, which it's an interpretation, which is funny enough, I use them in my presentation when I am here speaking at the museum, because those were some of the things that kind of struck me down. And I was like, oh, you know, I might be wrong about it. And I think all the pressure too of you being different, thinking different. Of course, you 17, 18, you kind of wanted to be embraced by others. Yes. And you want to, you know, so I think all of those stuff started really making sense of me. And I mean, yes, I was the one that didn't have the answers, you know. That was my part too, because of course I was not studying enough. I was not looking for answers. I was not having, but funny and sad at the same time. My questions, I started having questions when I was around 9 or 10 years old. But it
Wow.
was only when I was 17, 18, and 19, of course, because I was a little bit kind of, you start getting distance from your family, you know, not a lot of influence. You spend a lot of time in college hanging out with your classmates and those kind of stuff, that you start just like, oh, I don't want this for me, you know. But the questions early on, when I was 9 or 10 years old, I was already questioning a lot of things about the Bible and science and all those kind of stuff.
I know for my son and I, watching things like Dinosaur Train, it was a constant thing with Jordan and I to sit there and we're watching and they'd make some statement and Jordan would be like, Dad, is that part true? And we would sit there and we'd distinguish between the truth and the untruth because they do such a good job of just mixing those things together and making it seem like it's all truth. And I had to teach him how to separate the interpretation or the theories from here's the actual facts of what we see. And so that was always a great time for us. But you're right, it's kids at a young age see there's a difference between in the beginning God and God created the animals after their kind, with the evolutionary worldview, which says no, the animals evolved from one species to another species all the way up. So there's definitely a distinction there. Okay, so the evolutionary worldview has been pushing for quite a while, and I still remember, you know, what was it, 20 years ago when we first started seeing these feathered fossils come out. They really started pushing the dinosaur to bird evolution paradigm. And of course, they did that back with Archaeopteryx years ago. This is something you've studied. Can you take us through? Because for some people in colleges, this is one of those things that tripped you up. This is one of the things that trips them up and makes them go, well, yeah, dinosaurs turned into birds. I mean, we've got the fossil record. We've got fossils of dinosaurs with feathers on them. Can you take us back to where this came about and walk us through this whole dinosaur to bird evolution and tell us if it's true or not?
Okay. Well, in research, one thing that I have learned is go back to the past. Go back to the past and try to understand the history, how those things came to be, how they why they start thinking about those kind of stuff, you know. And when you go back to, about any field, anything, you go back and you try to understand how they came up with those ideas, when did it started, you start thinking things more, let's say, just clearer. You start seeing things the way they are, that sometimes after, let's say, 20, 30, or 100 years, when people are reading about, they're just reading what is in front of them. They're not reading the backstory. They're not reading the influences that definition or that story had, or the person is not reading what happened, just reading the consequence of what was done. So when I started studying the whole thing with dinosaurs and feathers, I just start like, okay, so what's going on here? So I went back to the history, and I was just trying to see that, for example, in Thomas Huxley, which was a very huge supporter of Charles Darwin.
Yeah, Darwin's bulldog was his nickname.
Yes, yeah, that was his nickname. Yeah, he was the one that actually, he was the first one to propose this idea of dinosaurs, relationship between dinosaurs and birds, because when they found Archaeopteryx 2 years after the book that Charles Darwin had written, he was like, hey, so we found the thing. Because the challenge between trying to see this transitional animal, it was right there, and they couldn't really respond to it. So when they found Archaeopteryx with some characteristic that at the time they thought it was more like a dinosaur thing, but they had feathers, they're like, hey, yay, so we found the thing that we needed to just show everybody, hey, you don't need to challenge the idea of Darwin anymore. We now have Archaeopteryx. So they found it, and Thomas Huxley, he was the first one to propose this relationship. And then, of course, they kept talking and talking and talking. But after around 100 years, over 100 years, when John Ostrom, he found Deinonychus, which he saw some similarities with Archaeopteryx. And then he went back to Thomas Huxley and then said, hey, he was right. So now I found Deinonychus, let's put everything together. And then from then on, they just start just like ramping out this idea of the relationship between birds and dinosaurs. So you go back to around 1861, and then now Ostrom 1969, with this idea, proposing and supporting the whole idea. The point is, when you go back to Thomas Huxley, you see that the reason why they were pushing the idea of Archaeopteryx being the thing, the icon for evolution, is because they needed something to prove their point. It's not because it actually had something solid to put together. Because when you go into to study Archaeopteryx, the little details of Archaeopteryx, I mean, it has so many things of a bird, like the feather itself. It's just something that it has been the key to determine if something is a bird or not. But that's the point. So let's go back to the history. They wanted something to prove that Darwin was right. They got Archaeopteryx, and then after around 100 years, over 100 years, they found that Dinosaurs and said, okay, that's great. Let's put everything together and try to keep pushing this idea. So it started in 1861, around that, 1859, and it has been pushed since then. And why? The reason why, it's because they wanted something to prove their point.
So they started with an evolutionary assumption. Hey,
Yes.
we know evolution happened. Now we need to find the evidence.
Right.
Then when they find this, they automatically assume they put it in as the evidence, but it's because they already had the assumption that this is what, that they would find something like this, instead of examining the evidence almost independently and saying, is this something that's a transitional form?
Yeah, which is something that happens a lot. We all have assumptions. The problem is not having assumptions, it's having the wrong assumptions. That's the problem. And they had the wrong assumptions because they started without God. You know, they started just thinking evolution is true. Let's try to prove it. And we found something. Hey, so let's now put our assumptions and try to fit in the evidence. And that's how they start doing things, which is very interesting because one of the guy, when he went to see the fossil, he was like, well, it looks like a bird, but it has something that is just different, you know. And others just like, well, some of them actually said that it was a pterosaur. So I mean, they were all over the world with their ideas because it was something new for them. But then after finding other fossils, we can see that Archaeopteryx has a lot of similarities with other birds, extinct birds. So it's not a problem at all. And some of the characteristics that, for example, Archaeopteryx has, other birds have, they're not just for dinosaurs. So for example, the claws. We have claws in around 9 orders of birds. So it's not something that is just for dinosaurs. Teeth. We have extinct birds that has teeth also. And some birds actually, extant birds, like living birds, they don't have teeth when they're adults, but they have teeth. Genetically speaking, they already have the gene there. It's just not showing, but they have the gene. So the point is, you know, those are not characteristics or features for dinosaurs. The same thing happens to some of the claws. Adults sometimes doesn't have claws, but when they're little, or they have the gene, or things like that happen a lot. So I think the whole point is we have to be very careful when we are studying the material, the fossil material. We have to understand, we need to understand that there are assumptions being applied on those definitions, and we have to take those on account, because if we don't take those on account, we're just going to be copy and paste what they think and what I think. I'm not doing anything new. I'm just using the same assumptions they're using and applying in the fossil that I'm finding. And that's the big problem.
So when it comes to Archaeopteryx specifically, that is a big one that they used to push the transitional form, like you're saying, to dinosaur to bird. Would as creationists, would we say, hold it. Archaeopteryx is in the bird kind. It's not in the dinosaur kind. It's not related to a reptile. There are birds that have these, I know the claws, the teeth, obviously feathers, and these certain characteristics, these would definitely push it over to the bird kind in the family of birds. Is that where we would be as creationists?
The point is, today, even like in evolutionary camp, depending on the characteristic that you're looking at, you can put Archaeopteryx in either side, right? Because the system now, I can pick and choose which characteristic I'm going to use.
I gotcha.
With cladistic, for example, cladistics now it's a system that they use, evolutionists that use to kind of put those things and run some tests and all those type of things. So it's interesting because I think it was 2019 they did one where they put Archaeopteryx as a bird. 2020 it went back to be a dinosaur. So like just a couple months, it was not even the whole year. It was just like from one thing to the other. So, I mean, we have to go back and see things in God's perspective, and even because my 2 points that I would like to bring up here is the history and why, and also the definitions, because the definitions were changed by, evolutionary scientists because the influence of evolution. So, for example, aves, which comes from Latin, which is what means bird. Aves doesn't mean bird anymore. Since 1986, ave, it's not bird. So actually, aves has around 4 to 6 different definitions. Depending on the group that it's studying, the group that is writing a paper, the group that it's doing research, you're going to have different definition of the word aves. For example, the word feather. When I talk to you about feather, and you talk to me about feather, we can kind of understand like, okay, what a feather is, but no, now we have to define what a feather is, because the definition of the word feather has been changed also because the influence of evolutionary ideas. So what they think is a feather is not a feather like we all understand what a feather is. A feather is that complex and all the structure, the branching structure of a feather, plus everything that came before a feather. So, for example, a filament is now defined as a feather because that's inside of the evolutionary ideas. So the word aves was changed, the word bird was changed, the word feather was changed, and the word dinosaur was changed, because now if you go and check what a dinosaur is, you're going to see characteristics of bird inside of the definition of a dinosaur. But why? In 1881, the word theropod was defined. And when it was defined, it was just like, hey, it's just dinosaurs, carnivore dinosaurs from Triassic to Cretaceous. That's it. This is 1881. 1986, over 100 years, someone says, hey, no, the word theropod means birds and dinosaurs together. So nothing changed, okay? Nothing changed. The data is the same, but the influence of evolutionary ideas changed the definition. Right. So now someone can find something that looked like a bird with feathers and everything and call a theropod, because they're all together in the same group. But why they're in the same group? Because they believe that dinosaurs and birds, they have a relationship. There's some relationship between birds and dinosaurs. So let's put them together in the same group. So sometimes when we're talking, especially when we're talking with evolutionist scientists, we have to say like, okay, what is your definition of feather? Okay, what is the definition of bird? What is the definition of aves? What is the definition of dinosaur? What is the definition of a theropod? Because sometimes we can be just like talking about theropod, but he's thinking about theropod, dinosaurs, and birds together. And I'm just thinking about the first definition of 1881, that is just dinosaurs. So we have to have those ideas in our mind, because when we're reading, we don't know. If we don't go back to the history and understand that those definitions change, we go back and we see and read, and it's like, oh, they're talking about the same thing that I'm thinking, but they're not talking about the same thing that we're thinking. It's totally different. So, the whole definition of the words changed, especially after 1986, with the influence of evolutionary ideas. And now we're just talking about, we're using the same word, but talking about things that are totally very, very different.
So that's interesting. The evidence did not change for dinosaur to bird evolution.
No.
The definitions of words are what changed to help promote dinosaur to bird evolution.
Yes. Yes, sir. Mm-hmm.
Unbelievable. Wow.
Yes. And when you go back and you see and you read, sometimes when I'm reading things, I'm just like, is my English working now, or it's messing up with my Portuguese? But I have some things here in a book that talks about it, and I just would like to read, if that's okay.
Yeah, please.
It's a secular book, and it says, most of these filamentous integumental structures have been identified as early feathers. So when they find the filament, they're just like, hey, this is an early feather. It's a feather. No problem at all. So they're calling feather just a filament, which in many cases have been just like being fiber, or sometimes they say, oh, but they found melanosome in those things. No, because melanosome, we have to be very, very careful when we're studying those things. First, because the shape of melanosomes that they use for coloring some of those dinosaurs, pterosaurs, the shape of those melanosomes, they are influenced by temperature and pressure. So when you have the fossil, you have the temperature and pressure right there. So the shape of those melanosomes is going to be different. It's not how it was originally. It could be how it was originally, but we don't know how to, because if a lot of pressure or temperature change there somehow, it's going to be different. But then they say, well, but more about melanosome is there's a technique, it's called TEM, that you can go and check if it's actually a melanosome or bacterial activity. And most of the papers that talk about melanosomes, most of the papers, they haven't not done the TEM. So they're seeing melanosome, but there are also some other evidence that could just be a bacterial activity, because the shape, the distribution, the way that the morphology, the way that they behave, it's really close, it's really similar to what we can see as melanosome. But there's a technique to find out, but they don't use it.
Interesting. So it could be, what they're seeing could literally be something bacteria, and they're not doing the check on that because they kind of want it to be
melanosome.
Proto-feathers, yes, the beginning of feathers.
Yes. So wow. Those are the things. I mean, it could be melanosome because, of course, we have a lot of really good preserved material, but we have to check, even like I want them to be melanosome, because that means it's like, hey, really good preservation. So it hasn't been there for millions of years. Yeah. But I cannot just push that. I have to be, okay, let's go and let's check. And I haven't, for example, some of the things that we see in papers is just like, okay, so why don't do that? Why don't they go ahead and do some research on this? No, they don't. Why? Because they want it to be melanosome. They want it to be, but someone that it's a big name in that area did a research on that, and McNamara, her name, and they found out that pressure and temperature change the shape. So you cannot really tell the color of dinosaurs or pterosaurs. It's just hard to do something like that. And in some other cases, just fibers, So the point is, if you define a feather as a filament, you're gonna see feather everywhere.
Okay?
Yes. If you go back to the first definition of a feather, no, you're not going to find feather in those dinosaurs. And some other thing that I would like also to point out here.
Well, before you point it out, I've got to let social media go. Guys, I'm so sorry to our YouTube and our Facebook audience out there, as well as to our podcast listeners and our television audience. I would love for you to hear the rest of this, because I want to ask Dr. Gabriela about some of you will remember when Scientific American came out and they had this big old feathered dinosaur on the cover, and they're like, oh my goodness, we've got the fossils from China. They prove the dinosaur to bird evolution. And then later we found out something tragic about these supposed feathered dinosaurs. I'm going to let her talk about that. But we're going to do that in this next hour. If you want to join in this next half hour, if you want to join us, come on over to creationtoday.org/partner. We'd love for you to hear the rest of this conversation, along with all the other conversations we have consistently that are helping us understand the truth. Because if dinosaurs did not have feathers, or if these things, these filaments are just filaments and they're not, the beginning of feathers, if words are all, and the definitions of words are the only evidence they really have, they don't have a lot of evidence for dinosaur to bird evolution. So I want to get into that more. Let me encourage you, go to Answers in Genesis and type in Dr. Gabriela's name in the search, and you'll see her article. It's on the screen now. You'll see her article come up, and check out her article where she actually does this research. While you're there, make sure you subscribe to get Answers in Genesis' newsletter. It's a free email that they send out. Would love for you to get that. They also have a powerful magazine you may be interested in as well. Is that the best way to read your stuff? Dr. Gabriela is right there on Answers in Genesis.
Yeah, I have other papers too on this topic, and of course, I'm going to keep writing about it. So more papers are coming.
Awesome. Oh, man. Well, guys, thanks so much for joining us. We look forward to seeing you next week. We're right here live at noon each Wednesday. So can't wait to see you next week for another powerful conversation. In the meantime, come on over to creationtoday.org/partner. We'll see you on the other side.